Hello, my name is Dr. Catherine Jones and I'm from the Wales Autism Research Centre, and I'm here to talk to you today about a study that's a few years old now, but I thought would be really relevant to this webinar. This is a published paper, so if you wanted to look at it, you could quite easily Google it, or you could email me and I could send you a PDF. So I thought I'd start with why I was interested in time in autism. My starting point really was that the observation that time sense is a fundamental part of the shared human experience. So if I said something to you like time flies when you're having fun, most people will understand that because they too have had the experience of doing something they really enjoy and then looking at the clock and being amazed by how much time has passed. Now, obviously, autistic people can experience difficulties with aspects of the neurotypical social world, and they can be complex and nuanced. And I wondered whether time could perhaps be relevant to some of those differences or difficulties. So my question really was, do autistic people have the same temporal perceptual experience as neurotypical people? So do they share time in the same way? Do they share time within their social world in the same way? Or is there perhaps a temporal disconnect that could lead to some of the difficulties that autistic people experience? So I chose a particular paradigm that I thought could help me investigate this. It's called the emotional temporal bisection task. I'll explain it incredibly briefly because I think you may well have been introduced to it elsewhere in the webinar. But with this task, an individual is presented with two durations, one that is called a short duration. In this example, it's 400 milliseconds. And then they'll be presented with another interval of time that's labeled a long duration. And in this example, it's 1600 milliseconds. So for example, they'll see a circle on screen for 400 milliseconds and a circle on screen for 1600 milliseconds. And they learn that one is short and one is long. And during the test phase, they are presented with lots of different intervals of different durations, and they just have to classify them as more similar to the short or more similar to the long interval, and you can plot a temporal bisection curve. So why this task was relevant to me was work by Sylvie Doual-Volley and others who have created a manipulation and enabling us to look at emotion within this task. So she's got rid of the rather plain circle stimuli and replace them with emotional faces. And the findings are fascinating and really well replicated. And that's that when you show somebody an emotional face, like an angry face in this example, they will overestimate them, how long they've seen them, compared to a neutral face. So you can see that on this curve, the dark filled line is the angry face, and it's shifted to the left of the neutral face, which is represented by the dotted line. And this has been put down to arousal. It's the idea that when you see an emotional face, like an angry face, it increases our level of arousal, and that increases our clock that is calculating time for us, and that leads to that overestimation. So this study led to two clear questions. First, is the implicit response to emotion or emotional cues in autistic people the same as neurotypical people? So will autistic people respond to emotional or angry faces just like neurotypical people? And I think the key here is it's an implicit measure. So I'm not explicitly asking somebody to label an emotion, to recognize it, to tell me what they do in a situation when somebody's feeling that way. It's entirely about an implicit response. And the second question I was asking is the temporal experience comparable for autistic and neurotypical people? Will the autistic people show the same temporal distortion and therefore have that same temporal experience, that same shared experience of the social world? So the next slide actually includes a picture of a spider, if you prefer not to look, but the spider picture won't occur on any of the other slides. Okay, so these are the stimuli I used. I had two tasks. The one used face stimuli, where we compared three different emotional faces to a neutral face. And the second task included natural stimuli, so non-human face, where we can compared a neutral flower stimuli to 3 different arousing natural images. And in terms of our results, I won't dwell on this because our findings were incredibly clear. If you look in both the autistic group on the left and the neutral group, neurotypical group on the right, this is for the faces stimuli, and you can see the black line representing the neutral face, and then the coloured lines are the emotional faces. And you will see in both groups, those emotional faces are shifted to the left. And that indicates that both groups are showing an overestimation of the emotional faces, so an overestimation of time. There were no significant differences between the groups. And in fact, we have an identical pattern for the natural stimuli. Both groups would overestimate the natural arousing stimuli compared to the neutral stimuli, and there was no difference between groups. And we also probed this a bit further by using a sample of undergraduate students, and we looked at their level of autistic traits, and we didn't find that autistic traits correlated in any way with the amount of overestimation that you would show. So our results were, we felt, convincing. So our conclusions were primarily that we found autistic people show typical temporal distortions to the arousing content of face or natural images. So there's no difference between groups on this task. So in terms of the 2 questions that I set, is the implicit response to emotional cues in autistic people the same as neurotypical people? Well, in our data, yes. And what this suggests is that the difficulties that autistic people have with processing emotion do not seem to relate to the very basic physiological sensitivity that is shown to emotional cues. The second question was, is the temporal experience comparable for autistic and neurotypical people? Well, of course, in our data, yes, because they did overestimate those emotional faces and showed that physiological sensitivity. However, it is important to note that we looked at a very specific type of temporal experience, and time is an incredibly broad topic, as I'm sure you're learning, and there are many different types of time that could be important to the social experience and to social interaction that would need to be looked at as well. So thank you very much.